Recording in progress.
Dear guests, on behalf of the Belgrade Security Forum organization team, welcome to this year's academic event dedicated to the topic of resilience to violent extremism. It is my great pleasure to announce the two distinguished speakers who will open today's session, Ms. Sara Grön, the Deputy Head of the OSCE Office in Serbia, and Mr. Nemanja Džoverović, the Academic Chair of the Belgrade Security Forum. Ms. Sara.
Good morning. I am very pleased and honored to be joining you for the opening of the academic event of the Belgrade Security Forum today. This is the 11th anniversary of the forum, and the OSCE mission to Serbia has supported its work for many years. And particularly, we have sponsored this academic event. We at the OSCE mission to Serbia are looking forward to extending our cooperation into a second decade. I'm bringing you greetings this morning from our head of mission, Ambassador Jan Bratu, who would have loved to join this event. But as you may know, the OSCE Secretary General is visiting Belgrade today, and he's joining her for a busy schedule, so this is an active day for the security community in Belgrade. The theme of this year's forum, Testing Humanity, is of particular relevance to OSCE as an organization. The OSCE takes a comprehensive approach to security, putting the human dimension at the forefront of its operations. This approach is based on the recognition by our 57 participating states that human rights and the rule of law are inseparable from security. And this is one of the reasons that we support this forum, because we see these things, an exchange between the academic world and civil society with security officials, as really critical, and we want to enable that. I'd like to highlight two aspects of this approach that are of key importance to our work at the OSCE, and I think to the discussions here today. These are, first of all, the development of an accountable and inclusive security sector. And second, active engagement and dialogue with academia and civil society on security issues. First, in developing an effective security sector, respect for human rights, the rule of law, inclusiveness, and gender equality are not optional. They are the building blocks of a state that is an effective security provider to all of its citizens. When these building blocks are in place, states contribute to stability, trust, and confidence, regionally and internationally. The OSCE mission to Serbia has been actively involved in strengthening democratic civilian oversight of the security sector. And we are grateful to the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, which has made our work in this area possible. Our work in this area is driven by a strong partnership with Serbia's security sector institutions, independent regulatory bodies, the National Assembly, civil society organizations, and academia. Their ownership of the process, and ultimately of the progress made, is crucial for sustainability. Our mission also focuses in this work on the diverse concerns and experiences of women and men, girls and boys. All of these perspectives are critically important to ensuring that policy solutions serve all members of a society. On my second point regarding engagement and dialogue, we think that civil society needs to be at the forefront of security debates, and state institutions should seek out and incorporate the views of civil society, including academia. The OSCE mission to Serbia encourages dialogue between representatives of government and civil society and facilitates the exchange of ideas between the academic and policy communities. We make a particular point of supporting young people as they engage and connect on issues of peace and security. The mission support for this academic event of this forum is part of our wider efforts to expand domestic expertise and educational opportunities in the area of security. One way we do this is through our support to the scholarship program for MA and PhD students of security studies at Belgrade University, a program we have supported for 10 years now. In 2015, the mission built upon the achievements of these security studies scholars by creating the Academic Alumni Network. This network facilitates easier communication and coordination in the fields of security sector government and reform. The network is truly exceptional. Its members have diverse and broad experience and work for a wide variety of institutions. This can only enrich discussions to contribute to Serbia's overall security sector reform and democratization. A significant part of an academic's life is presenting one's own work and exchanging views with peers. The Belgrade Security Forum has become a well-established venue for academic and policy exchange, and we at the OSCE Mission are very happy to help researchers take part. I'm encouraged by the ambitious agenda of the BSF and the number of distinguished speakers that will enrich it. I'm particularly pleased that Professor Newman is with us, since he has a direct connection to the OSCE, as some of you may know. He was the OSCE Chairperson in Office's Special Representative on countering radicalization and violent extremism in 2017, and he drafted a report on best practices from the OSCE area. In his report, he notes that the OSCE is well positioned to make an effective contribution to counterterrorism and radicalization, not least because of its diverse membership and the organization's comprehensive security mandate. I can only echo one of the conclusions in that report, that political and military issues cannot be looked at in isolation from human rights, as well as economic and environmental factors. I think that really will shape some of the discussions here today. The OSCE will continue to implement this comprehensive mandate, including here in Serbia. The way ahead will require overcoming joint challenges and differences through constructive dialogue in a true spirit of cooperation. I look forward to this fruitful exchange of ideas today. Thank you again for the chance to be here.
Good morning, everyone. Dear friends and colleagues, welcome to Belgrade. I'm delighted to see you all here. I never thought I would experience such a rush of adrenaline just seeing a large group of people in one room, but I guess this is the time that we live in, right? So I'm very happy that we're actually able to host you here in Belgrade. I'm thankful to organizers for providing us with this opportunity. The topic of this year's academic event at Belgrade Security Forum is resilience to violent extremism. And as you're all probably aware, the topic of violent extremism has been gaining ground in the both policy and academic world for the last 20 years, since 9/11, but even more so in the last couple of years with events in Christchurch, New Zealand, or Charlottesville, or Washington DC in US, where we saw the other side of the coin when it comes to the violent extremism. Here in Belgrade, we're not going to look at violent extremism or how to counter or prevent violent extremism, but we're going to look at the concept of resilience, both theoretically and empirically, what we're going to see from our presenters. And this is the concept that could kind of transgress in our field of peace and security studies via material sciences. And today is mostly understood as a capacity of individuals, communities, and formal and informal institutions to successfully adapt to external problems and threats. And we hope that this kind of paradigm shift, as Thomas Kuhn would put it, would be most beneficial in understanding and countering what has become one of the most serious challenges, not only to peace and security worldwide, but also to the liberal international order that has been in place since the Second World War. And in this kind of attempt for paradigm shifts, we are lucky enough to have a great group of researchers. We are lucky enough to have a mix of researchers who are doing their own research on resilience to violent extremism, but also researchers from 4 Horizon projects, PAVE, PREVEX, CONNECT, and DRED, that are also doing research on violent extremism and resilience to violent extremism. So I know that we're going to have very fruitful discussion with a lot of empirical findings, because I know that all 4 projects are actually ongoing with a lot of field work happening at the time. So this is a great opportunity to discuss these findings first person. And before I present our keynote speaker, although something has already been said, I think few thanks should be in order. As you all probably know, the position of academic chair brings you a lot of power and a little responsibility. So this is a position that we all like. But for ideas to be kind of transformed into the reality, we need help. At least I needed help, and I was lucky enough to have help from my colleague from Belgrade Center for Security Policy, Luka Šterić and Predrag Petrović. So thank you for the help and making this possible. And now, just a couple of words about our keynote speaker. If you are doing any kind of research on violent extremism, and most of us do in this room, you have probably heard or used the research of our keynote speaker, and that is Peter Neumann. Peter Neumann is a professor of security studies at the Department of War Studies in King's College London, and founder of International Center for the Study of Radicalization. Also, he was a as it was already mentioned, Special Representative on Countering Violent Extremism by OSCE. He established the MA in Terrorism, Security and Society at War Studies Department and served as a co-director. He also taught courses on terrorism, counterterrorism, intelligence, radicalization and counter-radicalization at King College London, Georgetown University, Johns Hopkins Universities, and Sciences Po. Peter Norman has authored and co-authored 7 books, most recently Blaster, Donald Trump's War on Terror, but also books such as Radicalized, New Jihadists and the Threat to the West, All the New Terrorism, and Strategy of Terrorism. He's currently working on a book on the ideas and ideologies of the contemporary far right. So just from saying these couple of words, you can see that I think we picked the perfect person for keynote lecture, and I invite Professor Neumann to take the floor and give his keynote speech. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you to both of you for such a kind introduction. I'm very grateful to be here in Belgrade and to be speaking to you this morning. And of course, this brings up great memories of 2017 when I was traveling the Western Balkans and Central Asia for the OSCE and produced that report, which you just reminded me of, which I had almost forgotten, is actually worth reading. So you can look it up probably somewhere on the OSCE website. But what I want to do today is, rather than looking into the past, I want to look into the future. And the way I want to do that is by drawing on an exercise that I've recently conducted in a different capacity. Right now, I'm also part of a network that probably many of you are familiar with. It's called the Radicalization Awareness Network of the European Commission. The European Commission has recently expanded this network and extended it to include a particular component aimed at policymakers. It's called RAN Policy Support. And what the European Commission also does is every year it publishes a list of priorities in the field of countering radicalization called the Strategic Orientations. And it tasked us, RAN Policy Support, to conduct a survey amongst experts to find out what's happening in the field of violent extremism and terrorism. What are the trends we are observing? What's going to be important for the next 5 years? And so we did that survey amongst experts we're connected with in our networks and a little bit beyond, and we came up with about 40 to 50 responses. And what I want to do is to share with you not necessarily an exact quantitative reasoning of the responses, but my thoughts on what I thought emerged from these surveys. And the questions that people were being asked were, what do you think is the most significant threat in the next 5 years? What are the most important political and social developments that are going to influence radicalization and terrorism? And what threats are going to become more and what threats are becoming less important? And of course, before I tell you the answers, I should say that, of course, these were European Union-based experts, so there is a little bit of bias in that, but there's probably a lot that you can also take away from this that is relevant to your work here in the Western Balkans, but also beyond. And there are 5 trends that I found in those responses to the survey that I thought are worth commenting on. The first answer that emerged very strongly and that I found very remarkable is that most people think jihadism is at a sort of crossroads. It's probably the first time that a large group of experts was divided on where this particular threat is going. If you had asked 10 years ago, if you had asked experts 10 years ago, they would have told you that jihadism is on the way down, Al-Qaeda is finished, Osama bin Laden is dead, we have to move on from this. If you had asked people 5 years ago, people would have said almost unanimously, the threat is on the way up. We're seeing more threat from groups like ISIS. Today, the responses are actually divided. The future of ISIS is far from assured. It's in different places, but what does that even mean? Afghanistan will become another safe haven for terrorist groups. We don't know. We certainly don't know how that will affect Europe. Is there too much attention being paid to returnees or too little? Are they actually coming? And what are the implications of all of that for policy? So jihadism, according to these experts, to these 40 to 50 experts that responded to the survey, is at a crossroads. And if anything, it's actually a more interesting, more exciting time for researchers because there's clearly some very unanswered questions. And we have to find out what are the actual circumstances under which jihadism is going to disappear or under which it is going to return. So jihadism at a crossroads is one finding that's emerging from these questionnaires very strongly. A second one is in response to the question, what is the biggest threat? And for some years now, the far right and the jihadists have been competing with each other for the quote-unquote prize of being the biggest threat. And obviously it depends on what country you're coming from. Mostly our respondents were from Western Europe. But what's interesting about the responses is that, again, they were almost equally divided. A significant number of the respondents said basically both are threats at the same time, and it's really hard to say which one of them is bigger. And this resonates very strongly with what I've experienced in my own work, that this idea of what is the biggest threat, is it jihadism or the far right, is almost used as a political football. People on the right of the political spectrum say jihadists, the bad Muslims, are the biggest threat. People on the left of the political spectrum are saying, oh, the far right is the biggest threat and you're not paying enough attention to them. The reality is that at least as Europe is concerned, these two threats are the biggest structural threats that we're likely to be confronted with for many years to come. And of course it fluctuates, and of course there's a tendency, depending on whoever committed the last atrocity, to exaggerate that. But we have to get to a point, I think, and this comes out very strongly from the survey results as well, we have to come to a point as governments, as international organizations, but also as researchers, to sustainably invest in our capacity to counter both. Because yes, one year it will be the far right, another year it will be the jihadists being back again, and recently we saw some attack by jihadists. But in reality, we have to equip our institutions to be able to respond to both, rather than shift resources from one into the other, depending on whatever is the last attack. And I was very, very grateful, actually, that this finding came out strongly from this survey. The third of the 5 findings, so you can keep track, so I'm not going to go on for too long. The third of the 5 findings coming out of this survey was what I'm calling, or what probably other people before me have called, the rise of pick and mix ideologies. That's very interesting because it essentially describes a fragmentation of ideologies on the far right side, but also on the jihadist side. In the age of the internet and in the age of the lone attacker, it has become much more difficult to enforce ideological orthodoxy. It's become much more difficult for groups to say to people, that's what you have to think, that's the scapegoat, that's the people that you have to attack. It's become much more difficult because people exercise their own agency and they pick and choose their own narrative depending on what resonates with them and depending on what they find on the internet. So like in Halle, Germany, we have an attack against Jewish people, against the synagogue. Then in New Zealand, we have an attack against Muslims. And then in Phoenix, Arizona, we have an attack against people who seem to be immigrants. As far as the far right, as far as messaging forums on the far right are concerned, it's all fine, it's all acceptable. There are different enemies, different narratives, but it's all fine. You do whatever fits your particular preferences best. And we're also seeing that, especially on the far right, in terms of how the far right connects with other subcultures on the internet. So we have, for example, right now, a very strong connection between the far right subculture and the misogynist subculture, the so-called incels. There are big overlaps. They are not exactly the same, but some people feel inspired by both, and they are picking and choosing their narrative. They're constructing their own rationale for the attack based on inspirations from both. We have an overlap between the far right and gaming. We have an overlap between the far right and even Satanism. All of that, as far as people on the internet are concerned, is fine. Everyone can pick and choose their own narrative and then act accordingly. Ideologies have become more fluid, and that makes it more difficult to deal with them, makes it more difficult to determine even what we are dealing with. Are the misogyny, the incels and the far right, are they exactly the same? I've even had students writing their master's dissertations about that, and the finding is, well, they are not quite the same. They are, for example, black incels. You know, are they also far right? The far right, the traditional far right, would certainly reject them. But they are misogynists as well. So it's become much more complicated. This is something that we have to prepare for. The fourth finding coming out of these survey results was that as far as the political and social developments that people think are most responsible for violent extremism, very consistently, people have highlighted the link between polarization, political polarization, and political violence. And now, for those of you who've been interested in this topic for many years, for as long as I've been a researcher in this field, people have always been looking for the root causes of terrorism, all sorts of studies about education, poverty, social inequality, etc., etc. But at this point in time, at least in Europe, it seems that most experts agree that really the key to understanding why it comes to terrorism and radicalization is the political polarization that we're seeing in a lot of our society, that a lot of people believe has actually strongly increased. Political views becoming more extreme and uncompromising. Recognizing that you get attention by appealing to the fringes rather than to the political center. Being provocative, being outrageous, especially on social media, rather than appealing to the center. That seems to be the key to political attention and to political success. Seeing things in a black and white way rather than in a more nuanced way. And again, especially on social media. And a lot of the respondents from this survey made a very strong connection between that, between the polarization that I just described, and the emergence of violent extremism. They are saying that basically it leads to a delegitimization of political systems, it creates the sense of an existential threat, and disputing the legitimacy of the political system and the existence of an existential threat basically provide the justification of violence. So I think for the first time, we have to think not just about violent extremism. This goes back to what I said, or like what I apparently said in my report many years ago, that we cannot see violent extremism in isolation. But that for the first time, we actually have to look at what is dysfunctional about the mainstream discourse in our societies, and to what extent does it give rise and encouragement? To what extent does it enable political violence by the fringes? So there seems to be, based on the responses, seems to be a stronger connection than ever before. And then the fifth and final theme coming out of the survey, and I always leave the best for last, is what I have called, and there's no real term for it yet, what I have called post-pandemic terrorism. And this is a clear reflection of what I believe could become, at least in some countries, the emergence of a new radical or extremist movement that has been mobilized to a great extent by the pandemic. People that were strictly opposed to the lockdowns, people that were or continued to be strictly opposed to vaccination, people who believe that a small global elite is engaged in a takeover and that draws heavily on conspiracy theories. So this movement has emerged over the last 2 years. We've seen them come out in big demonstrations. Last year, for example, in Germany, tens of thousands of people on the street. It has since then shrunk a little bit, but like a lot of social movements at this point, whilst shrinking in size, the core has actually become more radicalized. And what we're seeing in particular, and I observed this very closely, is that these people are developing concrete narratives of resistance, justifying whatever means are necessary in order to fight against what they believe is a totalitarian takeover of society by what in fact are democratically legitimate governments. It couldn't be more absurd if you look at it from the outside, but from their point of view, it is perfectly consistent with what they believe. And in fact, over the last few weeks, we've seen the first acts of violence. We had a killing in Germany. We had an attack on the Infectious Diseases Institute in Germany. We had in Italy a mass demonstration with violent overtones. The far right plays a role in this movement, but I think when you look at who participates in these demonstrations and also in the harder core of this movement, you can see that it is a lot more than that there are a lot of people involved, and first studies have shown this. There are a lot of people involved who've never participated in political movements before. There are a lot of people more on the esoteric fringes of society. So I do believe something new is emerging, that the far right would very much like to capitalize on this, but that in most countries, most of the countries that I've seen, it is certainly not driving it. So this is again something that I believe for researchers will be very interesting to watch. So those are the 5 trends or the 5 developments that came out of the survey. I'm just trying to repeat them very briefly. Jihadism at the crossroads, the far right and jihadists being equal in terms of threat, the rise of pick and mix ideologies, the link between polarization, political violence, and post-pandemic terrorism. And what this means, and I'm going to conclude now, what this means is that we have to broaden our scope. I think a lot of us over the past 20 years have become very lazy, have become very used to studying only one thing, to pretending that only one threat to democratic society and resilience existed. In fact, we may have to deal with the fact that there are multiple threats that are also interacting with each other, which could be the topic for another talk in its own right. We have to pay attention to more things. We have to accept that things are no longer as clear-cut as we believe they are, that they are more confusing, and we have to get ready to pay attention to multiple dimensions of things. So on the positive side, we are living in interesting, yet also in confusing times, and I look forward to hearing your ideas, your comments, and your questions for the rest of the day. Thank you very much. Now, should I take some questions? Should I moderate myself? So please, who is going to, who wants to ask something, if anyone? Yes, please, sir. Is there a microphone? Hold on.
Thank you very much. This is an intellectually stimulating start of the day, and we've been missing it since the Corona time, so I appreciate everybody who's come, and of course the speakers in particular. I'm the ambassador of Egypt. My name is Amr Al-Gouili, and you know, of course, how committed Egypt is to countering terrorism in general, including to any phenomena that leads to terrorism. So I'll just raise maybe two quick points. The first is on nomenclature. Sometimes we see that the CVE, countering violent extremism, is used more or less as a politically easier, more convenient nomenclature to avoid calling things what they are, which is terrorist organizations, and hence by basically giving not an equal standard of evaluating organizations or networks that do support terrorism and that do, you know, in different ways contribute to acts of terrorism. So first is on nomenclature. The second is on the prevention part, because it is much less effective to face a phenomena when it's actually spreading rather than to actually work on preventing it. And here I would highlight, I think, a major program and initiative that Egypt has taken by the Cairo International Center for Peacekeeping, Peace Building and Conflict Resolution, and it's called PRELT. PRELT is preventing radicalization and extremism leading to terrorism. So here you see very clear the equal approach to any phenomena that is basically terrorism, but taking place under different means. And I think there is a lot to partner in and to work together in through that program and others. And I believe that the Cairo Center, together with similar institutions on the Balkan and particularly this forum, can develop and exchange views and experiences together in this regard. So thank you again. It's a stimulating start of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. On the last point, I can only say, actually, in many ways, the OSCE was ahead of you, because CVE in the OSCE is not called CVE, it's called C-World, Countering Violent Extremism and Radicalization that Lead to Terrorism. So we had that idea as well, and I think it's a very good one. And I think the acronym rolls more easily off the tongue, so that's a good thing. On your first point, I agree with you. I think that countering violent extremism, CVE as an activity, has been misunderstood. It's sometimes been used as an easy way out for governments to construct activities that were barely connected with the activity that we're seeking to counter, which is countering terrorism. And I think the connections have to become more closely. I can tell you from my own experience in Germany, interacting with a lot of politicians and political stakeholders, CVE actually suffers from a birth defect, in the sense that a lot of people who are not part of the CVE crowd, who don't study and who are not interested in this all day, perceive it as a substitute for countering terrorism, when in fact it should be complementary. And if you understand it to be complementary, it makes a lot more sense. Of course, these two activities are separate, and they are dealing with different actors, and they're using different methods. But ultimately, the idea and the aim is the same. And just because I have a CVE program doesn't mean I should stop countering terrorism. And I think if you explain it that way, it makes a lot more sense, and it doesn't create the false competition. Sometimes, even in my own country, in Germany, you had a sort of competition between left-wing politicians who were saying we have to invest more in prevention, and right-wing politicians who say you have to invest more in countering terrorism. Actually, I believe you have to do both, because both are complementary to each other. And if you have a good CVE set of activities and an effective countering terrorism set of activities, then you have an overall more effective effort. So that's what I say to that. Do we have time? Are there any other questions or comments? Should have spoken for longer. Normally, yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Srdan Kosic. I'm editor-in-chief of VST from Montenegro. As from the media, we have seen that countering conspiracy theories has been extremely hard for mainstream media for a while. And especially in the during the pandemic, the peak of the pandemic and the post-pandemic period. Do you maybe recognize that with all these things that you mentioned about the fragmentation of ideologies, who could have predicted that conspiracy theories would be a thing in 2021, right? Could that be a focal point, for example, to create a global movement with all the pandemic and post-pandemic efforts, things you mentioned about the vaccination, about the lockdown, about the whole idea of a huge conspiracy behind it, to rally sort of a new ideological movement that would present it on a global scale, something similar that we have seen in the States from 2016 to...
Wow, we had that. It was called the Enlightenment, right? I think you're absolutely right, and I think as far as research is going, this is something that we should focus on very strongly. I think this rise of, I mean, there have always been conspiracy theories, but never before have they been so powerful and so influential. And it's so difficult to deal with them. Now, I'm not an expert on conspiracy theories, and I don't pretend to know exactly how to counter them. None of us have a good answer to that yet. What I know is that conspiracy theories become very influential and very powerful in times of great uncertainty. And the pandemic has, for many people, been a very confusing moment in time. They couldn't make sense of it. And people who are not tuned into politics all day, people who are not intimate with policymakers, they look for simple, easy answers, and they may be absurd answers. And together with the internet providing that, I think you've had a situation where these theories have become very, very powerful. It's so difficult to do something about it because even though, for example, big tech firms like Facebook and Google with YouTube, they are now taking down videos that are providing obviously false information, right? So if someone provides obviously false information, typically that video, for example, on vaccinations or on other things related to the virus, that video or that tweet is being taken down. The problem with conspiracy theories is that they are not always obviously false information. They are nonsense. And in most of our countries, it's not punishable by law to talk nonsense, right? There's no criminal offense saying if you say a stupid thing or if you say nonsense, then you go to prison. And to be honest, I don't want that to be the case. So it's always going to be difficult to take down videos, for example, articulating elaborate theories of who holds power in the world. And because they may obviously be nonsense, but that's not necessarily a crime. And that's that space, you know, some people have described it as awful but lawful. The space of awful but lawful, that's a really difficult space to deal with. If someone calls for people to join ISIS, you can deal with that. We have laws for that. But if someone says something that is stupid and malicious and bad, but not necessarily a crime, that's something that our democratic societies have a hard time dealing with it because it's clearly his view or her view and his freedom of expression to say that, even though it's stupid. So how do we deal with that? And this is something that perhaps, you know, we should have a conversation on. Yes.
Any more questions?
Yeah.
Thank you, Markus Aukic from the organization team.
Marcus.
A question on Afghanistan. You said that there is uncertainty in the academic community on whether Afghanistan will once again become a sort of a safe haven for terrorists worldwide. So where this uncertainty comes from and what is your view? Thank you.
Okay, so to give you a brief overview of the arguments. So the arguments in favor of it becoming a safe haven again are, number one, it used to be a safe haven. Osama bin Laden took it as a safe haven in 1995, 1996, stayed there, built up Al-Qaeda, attacked 9/11. We all know the story. And that 20 years ago, the Taliban were willing to do that. A second argument in favor of that is that the Taliban, even though they are rhetorically moderating when they sit in Doha, still have a very close connection or are integrally linked to the so-called Haqqani network, which is part of the Taliban, which is based in parts of Afghanistan, which has historically and personally very close links to Al-Qaeda. And based on these arguments, people are saying that there's a risk that people are going to be allowed to settle there again. The counter-arguments are that Afghanistan, I mean, often it is being compared to Syria and Iraq. And Afghanistan is not Syria and Iraq. Number one, it is much more difficult to travel there. So I don't think we're going to see the exodus of so-called foreign terrorist fighters traveling there, 40, 50,000 as they did in Syria and Iraq. It's much more uninhabitable. It's much less sexy. There's no jihadist utopia. There's no sort of caliphate rising in Afghanistan. It's just like fighting and bad living. So it's not particularly attractive. And the second counter-argument is that for groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, Back in 1996, Afghanistan was literally the only place in the world they could go to where they could get safe haven. Today, there's a lot of places they could go to instead that are much closer and much more convenient. They can go to Libya, they can go to northeastern Syria. There's a lot of places that are much more convenient, much more inhabitable, and much more strategically important for groups like Al-Qaeda to go to, and in fact, they are already there. So why would you go all the way to Afghanistan, to a place that has, other than for Central Asia, has no strategic significance, if you can stay close to Europe? So yes, so those are the pros and cons, and no one has a certain answer yet. I think it will be very interesting for all of our countries, including for countries in the Western Balkans in particular, to watch very closely if there's movement towards Afghanistan, if there are people trying to travel to Afghanistan, if there's any interest in that. So far, I haven't seen much interest, but it could, of course, change. And of course, secondly, it is very important to see how the conflict between ISIS and the Taliban in Afghanistan is going to play out. Right now, it seems that it is escalating very sharply. So no one knows exactly where Afghanistan is going to be in a year's time. No one knows exactly what other regional powers like Russia, China, and Iran are going to do in order to deal with that situation. And no one knows yet how jihadist groups that are based in the West or in the Middle East are going to respond to that. Are they going to go or are they not going to go? Again, the conclusion is it's an exciting time for research, maybe a bad time for the world, but it's an exciting time for researchers, and we have to look at that and watch it very closely. Sorry, here.
Professor, thank you very much. I'm the Bulgarian ambassador. Thank you very much for your remarks, and I also thank the two previous speakers who spoke before you. And obviously, it was very interesting and very useful to all of us, I hope. It's been 10 years since I first took my course on countering violent extremism in Garmisch-Partenkirchen at the George Marshall Center, and then I followed a course on foreign fighters at the Leiden University. So obviously the research has advanced a lot.
Yeah.
And not only the researchers, but also the practitioners have good record in this. I'm referring to your conclusions that namely the threat is multiple, and we have to be focused on more than one threat, and you have now spoken about the interesting time for researchers. What could be, from that point of view, the next areas for researchers? How are we going to cover, to face this multiple threat?
Well, thank you very much, and I think that's a great question to finish up with. I think that, first of all, we shouldn't necessarily stop what we're doing now. I think, as I said before, when I say jihadism is at a crossroads, it doesn't mean it's finished. I think we will continue to see attacks, we will continue to see movement across the world, especially in a region like the Western Balkans. The returnees issue is a very important one for countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina, because it can affect the stability, the political stability in those countries as well. So that's important that we continue to look. But I do think that we have to focus on these emerging threats, like the one that I talked about at the end. What is going to happen to this movement that has emerged out of the pandemic? We have to look at the far right. We have to look at what some people call cumulative extremism, which is the relationship or the links between the far right and jihadists, to what extent they egg each other on, to what extent they give each other legitimacy. And then, of course, one topic that I also talked about in my presentation is very much the idea that we have to understand the link between mainstream political discourse, or the fringes of mainstream political discourse, polarization in our society, and to what extent it actually furthers and increases political violence and extremism. So these would be the topics I would be interested in looking at. I think there are a lot more. I think that, for example, all of these topics have a gender dimension. all of these topics have to be looked at also in terms of what is the role of women, for example, in jihadism, in the far right, in this new pandemic movement. All of these topics need to be looked at from that perspective too. So I think there's a lot to do, a lot more than previously, and it's always difficult actually to get attention for this when nothing happens. And this is the sort of, as a very final remark, this is my big regret working in this field, that in fact when something goes wrong, when there's a terrorist attack, when there's a 9/11, or when there is a New Zealand attack, it's very easy as a researcher to get interest, to get funding, to get attention by policymakers. But before, that's not necessarily the case. So right now, there's not a major attack by this post-pandemic movement. It is just building up, but that's actually the most interesting point to look at this movement. That's the most interesting, or that's the most important point at which to try to understand what is actually happening in order to prevent bad things from happening. But the political dynamics are such that we always have to wait for something bad to happen in order for the attention and the resources to flow. So for those of you in the room here who are policymakers, think about that. Maybe we can change that. Thank you very much again.
For this insightful lecture.
Thank you. Thanks.
We'll have 10 minutes break, and then at 10 a.m. sharp, we'll have a next panel, please.
you.